Hi, welcome to our first remote learning lecture for Trig. Welcome back after spring break. So we're going to try this out here with my chalkboard that I have in my basement. We're going to see how this goes. Any feedback that you have on these videos is much appreciated, and I'm sure that they will improve over time. So today what we're going to talk about is we are going to talk about section 9.7, which is graphs of the other four trig functions. So you might remember before the break, for your exam 2, you had to learn a lot about the sine and cosine functions. We went on a first date where you met them. We went on a second date where you learned important things like the domain and the range and the period and things like that. And then we spent a lot of time modifying the sine and cosine functions by stretching and compressing horizontally, stretching and compressing vertically, shifting horizontally, and shifting vertically. We're not going to do all of those details with these four trig functions, but we do want to get to know what these graphs look like. All right, now before we can actually start drawing the graphs of these functions, we have a few preliminaries to look at. That baby crying in the background, that's my daughter Ariana. So I'm going to bring her over here. This is Ariana, and she's going to help us. Okay. All right, so what we want to think about is we want to, first of all, remind ourselves about the 6 trig functions and their definitions in terms of x's, y's, and r's. You might not have thought about these in about a week over spring break, so I'll remind you about them and think about these and make sure that you remember them as well. So we have sine of theta is y over r, cosine of theta is x over r, and tangent of theta is y over x. Those are the first 3 trig functions, and the reciprocals, the reciprocal of sine is cosecant of theta, which is r over y, secant of theta, which is r over x, the reciprocal of cosine, and the reciprocal of tangent is cotangent of theta, which is x over y. Okay. So these are your 6 trig functions and their definitions in terms of x's, y's, and r's. All right, I'm going to write down a definition now. And our definition is the definition of a trig identity. And a trig identity is an equation that relates trig functions and is true for all values of theta. Well, at least for all values of theta within the domain of our functions. Okay. All right, so here's our first example of a trig identity. This one says tangent of theta is equal to sine of theta divided by cosine of theta. Tangent of theta is equal to sine of theta divided by cosine of theta. All right, so why is this actually true? Well, one way that we can show that this equation or this identity is true is by deriving the identity. And so the way that we do that is we start with maybe the more complicated side of this identity. So the more complicated side is sine of theta divided by cosine of theta. Cool. Now, here's where I need these definitions. So the thing is, I know that sine of theta is y over r. And I know that cosine of theta is x over r. So I'm going to replace sine and cosine with their x, y, r definitions. And take a look at what I have now. I have a fraction divided by a fraction. Now, when you divide by a fraction, that's the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So another way to write this is y over r times the reciprocal of x over r. So times r over x. All right. Now, when I look at what's going on here, the thing I notice that's kind of cool is there's an r on the top and an r on the bottom, and so they cancel. And that's great. She did not like that we canceled the r's. Sorry. Okay, so let's get rid of the r's, and we are left with y over x. And if I look at y over x, I look back over here, and what I notice is that y over x, that's the same thing as tangent of theta. So y over x is equal to tangent of theta. Okay, so take a look at this string of equal signs. We started with sine of theta over cosine of theta, and we're ending with tangent of theta. And in between, we manipulated the x's, y's, and r's to get from sine of theta over cosine of theta over to tangent of theta. All right, so this thing that we've done here where we have shown that one side is equal to the other side by turning it into our x's, y's, and r's, this is called deriving a trig identity. Okay. All right, now as part of your first remote assignment, you're going to be asked to derive a different identity, and the identity is cotangent of theta is equal to cosine of theta divided by sine of theta. Now, these two identities, tangent of theta equals sine of theta over cosine of theta, and cotangent of theta is cosine of theta over sine of theta, these two identities together are called the quotient identities. Now, these two quotient identities that we have, you want to look at them, you want to write them down, you want to maybe even put them on a piece of paper and hang them on your refrigerator, or if you have a whiteboard marker, write them on your mirror in your bathroom. You want to memorize both of these quotient identities. They're going to be really important for your future classes. Okay, so those are the quotient identities. There are a couple of other identities that I want to talk about today. Along with the quotient identities are a collection of identities called reciprocal identities. And the first reciprocal identity is an identity that says that cosecant of theta is equal to 1 over sine theta. Okay. And what we're going to do is we are going to derive the identity of cosecant of theta is equal to 1 over the sine of theta. Okay, now to derive this identity, I want to look at both sides of the equation, and I want to notice which side looks more complicated. And in this case, the more complicated side is on the right because there's more stuff going on. So we have 1 over sine theta. And now I want to think to myself, all right, what is the definition of sine in terms of x's, y's, and r's? And I know that sine of theta is y over r. Okay, cool. So that means we have 1 over y over r. And when I divide by a fraction, that's the same thing as multiplying by its reciprocal. So another way to write 1 divided by y over r is 1 times r over y. I have flipped our fraction upside down. All right, so I have 1 times r over y. That's the same thing as r over y. And if I still had my list of definitions over here, I might be able to look at it and say, okay, I remember that cosecant of theta is r over y. So r over y is cosecant of theta. So I started with 1 over sine of theta, and I linked together a bunch of x's, y's, and r's, and I came up with cosecant of theta. All right, so we have just derived the identity cosecant of theta is 1 over sine theta. All right, this is one of 3 reciprocal identities. The other two identities for the reciprocal identities are secant of theta equals 1 over cosine of theta, and cotangent of theta is 1 over tangent of theta. And part of your remote assignment, in addition to deriving the second quotient identity, your job will be to derive these two reciprocal identities. All right, so that's the end of our first part of our first lecture. Thank you for listening.